Welcome and good afternoon. My name is Susan Bida. I am the Executive Director for the Collaboratory Against Hate. This is the group that is hosting the speaker series. The Collaboratory Against Hate, just for some background, is a research and action center whose mission is to counter extremist hate and its violent consequences through multidisciplinary research and partnerships with end users of the research. We are a joint venture between Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh, leveraging the expertise across both campuses, which makes us a very unique center focused on extremist hate in our country. If you are interested in learning more about the Collaboratory, please visit our website at collabagainsthate.org. And if you're interested in joining our newsletter list, please find a link in our chat. We are so pleased to host the speaker series with Phia Salter, and want to thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us and participate. I'd now like to introduce Anna Fisher, who will introduce Phia. Anna Fisher is an associate professor of psychology at Carnegie Mellon University. She is also a co-chair of the Collaboratory Against Hate's work group on educational interventions for youth. Thank you very much, and you can take it now, Anna.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm excited to see such great interest in today's event. I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome our speaker today, Dr. Phia Salter. Welcome. Dr. Salter is an associate professor of psychology at Davidson College. She earned her Ph.D. in social psychology with a graduate certificate in African studies from the University of Kansas in 2010. And then she spent several years teaching and conducting research at Texas A&M University. Dr. Salter's contributions to research, teaching, and service were recognized with a Ray Rockroth Fellowship at Texas A&M, which is awarded by the College of Liberal Arts to the most research productive and impactful recently tenured professor. Dr. Salter's contributions were also recognized with Outstanding Teaching and Mentoring Award from the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. In her research, Dr. Salter uses cultural, psychological, and critical race perspectives to inform her work on collective memory, social identity, and systemic racism. Her research aims to address social inequalities and injustices and facilitate dialogue and action that empowers us to identify, challenge, and dismantle different forms of oppression and injustice. The work that Dr. Salter is doing is of essential importance to the work that we're doing in the Collaboratory Against Hate. And it is my great pleasure and great honor to have Dr. Salter share today her research with us. Thank you very much for joining us, and welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to talk about some of the work I've been doing. And so the title of my talk today is Unknowing Inequality: A Critical Race Psychology Perspective on Engaging Systemic Racism. And I like to always start by letting people know where I'm coming from in terms of both theory, but also personal background. I'm trained as both a psychologist and in Africana studies, as Anna said, and I've spent a lot of time at various institutions that have all informed my perspectives on racism. And these spaces have included predominantly white institutions, historically Black colleges, some time in Ghana, and then also it's sort of bookended by me beginning my undergraduate studies at Davidson College and now returning home. And so just to give you a little bit of a picture of what we'll talk about today, where we're headed, I'll talk about applying cultural insights to racism. I'll talk a little bit about critical race theory and some synergistic connections in cultural psychology. And then I'll give you two broad empirical examples of an application of these insights to racism, and then some future directions in looking forward. So I kind of told you a bit about where I'm coming from in terms of geography, but theoretically, I'm coming to these topics from a cultural psychological perspective. Cultural psychology has largely been defined as the study of how psyche and culture make each other up. Sometimes you'll hear this referred to as mutual constitution. So in one direction, our cultural context shapes our everyday experiences, what we believe, how we act, what we think is right. And the influence of culture doesn't stop there, because we're also active agents in this process. And so we deposit our ideas, our beliefs, what we think is right and wrong back into the world, which then goes on to continuously shape our cultural context, shape our institutions, and shape our daily experiences. Cultural psychologists like to kind of liken this to we are fish in water. Sometimes we may not necessarily notice all the different ways that culture is influencing us, but it's all around us. And so I've been thinking about race and racism as a societal factor, a pervasive idea that might be shaping our psychological experiences, but also thinking about how our psyches also are shaping how racism is functioning in our society. And so there's three key insights that I believe you can derive from turning to cultural psychological frameworks to understand racism. One is to think about racism in the everyday structure of our world, whether we're talking about health, wealth, criminal justice, empirical and statistical realities suggest that Black Americans and other racial minority groups face disparities in everyday treatment, and that it's all around us. A second insight is that there are racism relevant ways of seeing the world. So for better or worse, these pervasive ideas around race shape the way that we see ourselves and each other. And then third, we produce or reproduce racism through our preferential selections and everyday activities. So the things that we do have a influential role in how the world is shaped. And it's not only sort of the conscious actions that we may be engaging in, but the sort of everyday realities we're either reproducing racism or working to dismantle it. And so one example, just quickly, of where I saw this playing a role, while I was in graduate school, I visited several high schools in the Kansas City area and documented how they were approaching Black History Month. And one of the ways I saw conversations about race and racism being embedded in the structure was how they represented Black History Month. So whether schools were highlighting the celebration of diversity and focusing on ties between different groups, or whether the representations were specifically focused on Black peoples, there were some patterns of these representations that varied by school type. So predominantly white schools tended to focus more on diversity, and predominantly Black and Latino schools tended to be more focused on not only celebrating Black history, but also highlighting some of the historical barriers that may have made celebrating Black history a necessity in the first place. And so it was not only in the real world where went and looked at these Black History Month displays. Also, when you bring it into the lab, we saw differences in how students were producing representations for Black History Month. So the poster in sort of the center left was produced by a white student who, again, was really emphasizing themes of diversity, sort of the global take on Black History Month, whereas a Black student, that poster on the right, was emphasizing the information and specific achievements of the community. And so when thinking about how race and racism function as a pervasive idea in our society, I turn to critical race theory to also think about, so we say we want to eliminate racism, sort of dampen it, and yet it still persists. What might be some of the frameworks and reasons why? And so I won't highlight all the common ground and core themes and tenets within critical race theory, but to highlight two key ideas that informs the empirical examples I'm going to talk to you about today. So one is that people of color have a unique voice informed by their histories and experiences with oppression that may be foreign to many white people, given that they may not have those same experiences or exposure. And then also that counter storytelling reveals and resists the racialized basis of US society. And so in challenging narratives that might frame African Americans as deficient or pathological might be another way to also reveal how racism persists in the world. And I just want to highlight that in terms of taking whether it's a critical race theory approach or cultural psychological approach to the study of racism and understanding Black experiences, I want to highlight that it's not just how the world sees Black communities, right? That's an important thing to understand and to highlight, but it's just as important to also take a standpoint from Black communities and understand how we might see the world, how we might understand what's going on in our society. And so for the first empirical example, I'm going to talk to you about some data showing racial gaps in perceptions of racism and how they might reflect racial gaps in historical knowledge. I like to ground this work in the stories and experiences that have informed the work that I'm going to talk to you about today. And I'm willing to bet that many of you will recognize the images that are on your screen of Black men and Black women who are unarmed, killed by police or self-appointed vigilantes. What separates the top row from the bottom row is about 10 years, but the stories and the circumstances feel cyclical to me, and because the same racial divides continue to persist. So whether they were just out in the neighborhood, minding their business like Trayvon Martin or Ahmaud Arbery, or asleep at home like Rekia Boyd or Breonna Taylor, gunned down in the street by police by Michael Brown or Walter Wallace Jr., or just trying to breathe and experiencing, just trying to breathe and live, and the experiences of Eric Garner and George Floyd, each taken from us too soon. And what also continues to persist, not just the particular circumstances that have shaped or ended each of these individuals' lives, but also there have been some perceptions of whether these events are racism relevant. And what we see across, so these are examples of national polling data, where Black people are more likely to say race is a factor in whether a jury decides to indict police officers who have killed an unarmed Black man, or whether we think about the role of racial discrimination in influencing how the outcomes of Black communities. White Americans are less likely to say that racism is a role, while Black communities are more likely to say that racism plays a role. And one explanation is that Black communities may be drawing upon, again, a cycle of violence that has plagued our history. So you may recognize Kimberly Jones from a viral video where she was discussing essentially our attention to rioting when we should have been attending to why people were upset in the first place. And so she's talking about how if we look back and liken the experiences of Black Americans to playing an unfair game of Monopoly for 50 years, every time you played, if the person you were playing with didn't like what you did and they got to just throw the board away or make you start over, she likens it to the race massacre in Tulsa, race massacre in Rosewood, and suggests that these patterns have been repeating themselves. And she asks, how can you win? You can't win, the game is fixed. And what she's drawing upon are historically documented events where white mobs had attacked Black residents, homes, businesses, and predominantly Black neighborhoods, whether that was in Greenwood or Tulsa. And the idea is that if people are drawing upon this knowledge to inform how they're seeing the world, then essentially a knowledge of history might be explaining perceptions of racism. And we named this hypothesis after some lyrics from Bob Marley's song, Buffalo Soldiers, where he says, if you know your history, then you would know where you're coming from. Then you wouldn't have to ask me, who the heck do I think I am? And so I also want to point out that while knowledge of history may be one way to explain why Black communities might be seeing more racism in our society, I'd like to suggest that there's always two sides of this very coin. So while these headlines are like, oh, why might Black communities be saying race is more of a factor, or Blacks are more likely than whites to say discrimination plays a role, I'd like to also suggest that it's just as valid to consider that whites are less likely to say race plays a factor in the non-indictment in both the Ferguson case and in the case involving Eric Gardner, or when we think about racial discrimination, that white Americans are far less likely than Black Americans to say discrimination plays a role. And so the crux of the Marley hypothesis is to suggest that group differences and racism perception might reflect white Americans' ignorance about the extent of anti-Black racism in our history. So I'm going to talk to you about some empirical data we gathered to test this idea. I'm going to talk about two studies together. The original Marley hypothesis paper was published in 2013, a replication in 2019. And so, we began by asking people, how much racism do they perceive in our society? And so they might see example items like high rates of poverty among African Americans, Latinos, Native Americans. To what extent do you think prejudice, discrimination, or racism plays a role? Scale to 1 to 7. And like those national polls, we replicate that Black Americans are more likely to say that racism was playing a role in these systemic examples. And that was both true in the original study and the replication. We also asked people to tell us about their racial identity. So we used a set of items from the collective self-esteem scale that looks at racial private regard. This is really about how you feel about belonging to your racial group. So for example, in general, I'm glad to be a member of my racial group. People would answer on a scale from 1 to 7. And so next I'm going to show you the relationship between how people were identifying and their perceptions of systemic racism. So both in the original study and the replication, the yellow line there represents white Americans. So the more they identified with being white, the less racism they saw in society. For our Black participants, the more they identified with being Black, the more racism they saw in our society. And in the replication, we still see this relationship among white Americans, but the relationship among Black Americans was positive, but not statistically significant. Okay, so the Marley hypothesis is about knowledge of history. And so we gave our participants a critical Black history quiz. They saw 30 items. Now, if we were in person, I might put you under a little bit of pressure and ask you to read these items and tell me whether they are true or false. So for example, Medgar Eggers struggled for the civil rights of Black Americans and was assassinated for his writings. Is that true? Is that false? How certain are you of your answer? Paul Ferguson was shot outside of his Alabama home for trying to integrate professional football. True? False? How certain are you of your answer? And so our participants saw a mix of both true and false items. We were interested in their ability to say true when the item was actually true, right? To detect these true items without being distracted by these false items. So for example, to our knowledge, we couldn't find any historically documented cases of an individual named Paul Ferguson shot outside of his Alabama home for trying to integrate football. There are many race-relevant acts, but the Purity Act of 1980 it's made up, right? There wasn't an act called Purity Act that prevented Black immigrants from entering the US, though there are some policies that have been racially relevant in restricting who could and could not come into our country. Okay, so I mentioned that we're interested in looking at the hits, right? Can you detect when an item is true? And we saw that we had a difference between Black and white participants. Our Black participants were more likely to identify these hits, right, say true when it's actually true. But we also wanted to take into account false alarms. Is it that Black Americans might be saying true to everything that kind of looks or sounds like racism? And in fact, they aren't, right? They weren't being necessarily distracted by false alarms, at least not to a greater extent than their white counterparts. And so we take into account a score that subtracts the false alarms from their hit rates in determining their historical knowledge. And so in putting it with the Marley hypothesis, right, this idea that critical Black history might explain those gaps in perception, we anticipated, right, that white Americans would have less critical Black history knowledge, but among those who have critical Black history knowledge, that would be positively related to perceptions of racism. In terms of the interaction between how racial identity, right, how much you identify with being a member of your racial group, and how that might interact with perceptions of racism. So on your screen, you're seeing seeing our results, right? So our white Americans did have less Black history knowledge than their Black counterparts. And this gap in knowledge actually works to explain the gaps in perceptions of racism. And at the bottom, you're seeing the racial identity by racial category interaction. That's just representing those earlier graphs I showed you, where the more participant identified with being Black, the more racism they saw, the more they identified with being white, the less racism they saw. And so some key findings, so like the national polling, white Americans perceived less racism in society than their Black counterparts. White Americans had less critical Black history knowledge than their Black American counterparts. And these Black-white differences in historical knowledge statistically help to explain the Black-white differences in racism perception. And I also just want to quickly point out that so it's not just data from our lab showing evidence for the Marley hypothesis. There's some work that's been done outside of my lab where historical knowledge predicts perceptions of racism. And in a recent study by Zell and Lasick, they actually compare white Republicans and white Democrats. And white Republicans had less knowledge of historical racism than their Democratic counterparts. And the political differences in perception of racism was mediated by their differences of knowledge of historical racism. Okay, so for a second example, I want to talk about testing some brief critical interventions to see if we might shift some of these racism perceptions. So following the death of Freddie Gray, he died in police custody. It was alleged that they gave him a rough ride where you are handcuffed in the back of a police van, but not secured, and they might, drive over potholes or other things to make the ride tougher in the back. He sustained fatal injuries as a result of his transportation and arrest. And in the aftermath, people, again, were talking about the frustration within the Black community and their expression of that frustration in riots in Baltimore. And most of the articles in the aftermath of his death sort of described it as chaos and really focused on the riots. But there were some that talked about how the unrest in Baltimore is linked to historical racism in the city of Black Baltimore. And so in this study, we're going to have people engage with this history and look at their perceptions of racism. So in this case, we again surveyed people, this time online. What they're going to do is they're going to listen to an NPR clip. We chose 2 NPR clips so that they would have, the same kind of tone and tenor. They either listen to a clip on historical racism or the intelligence of pigs as a control condition. Then they completed measures on their perceptions of systemic racism, the same as the previous study. We give them a short critical history test just about some of the content that was within the historical racism clip, some self-reported knowledge. Did you learn anything from engaging with this clip? And then we asked them their beliefs about how policy might have shaped the segregation in the city. So, for example, the clip discussed blockbusting, where African Americans could only live in certain neighborhoods, which created more demand and higher prices. And when they actually managed to break out of those areas and buy a home in neighboring areas, you would also see characteristic white flight. And so the policies that were informing where Black people could live and where they could buy homes and who could be given loans to buy homes in certain areas have all shaped the residential realities of Baltimore and many other places in the United States. And so, for example, they would hear its policy was that the public housing could only be used to house people of the same race as the neighborhood in which it was located. And so public housing initially started off actually integrated, but then it was segregated by the Federal Housing Administration. So after our participants listened to a clip, they answered a few questions, for example, about African-American wealth, what percentage of it is in relation to white American health. They also answered questions about the extent to which the audio clip helped them learn more about the history of racism, and then whether past federal and local housing policies helped cause present-day racial inequality in the United States. Okay. So first, right, as sort of a, you can think of this as a manipulation check. Our participants in the critical history condition reported more knowledge gained in terms of historical racism. They also answered more of those questions about residential segregation correctly. And I should mention that in this case, all of our participants are identified as white. Okay, so we also looked at their perceptions of racism. So the same kind of scale as in the first study I talked about. Our participants in the critical history, right, that listened to clips about housing segregation, thought that there was more systemic racism playing a role today. They also were more likely to endorse the idea that it was policy that created our current day ghettos and instances of residential segregation. Okay, so how are all of these factors related to one another? So we believe that the treatment, right, listening to the critical historical racism would increase the amount of knowledge that our participants said they gained, and that would be related to their beliefs that policies were involved in creating Black ghettos, and that understanding this policy link would also shape perceptions of racism in the present. And essentially that's what we found, right? So our participants who listened to the critical history clip reported more knowledge gained. More knowledge gained informed the belief that these policies were created by the government, and also this belief shaped perceptions of racism. What's interesting is how racism, how racial identity was related to racism perception. So overall, the more our participants identified with being white, the less racism they saw, very similar to the first set of studies that I presented. But there was also an interaction between racial identity and our condition and its effects on perceptions of racism. So what you're seeing here is an overall effect that the more our participants identified with being white, the less racism that they saw. But you're also seeing somewhat, when we account for people who say that they learned something and that the policy mattered, we're seeing what looks like a backlash effect. So within the treatment condition, so those who listened to a clip about critical history, that relationship between identifying as being white and perceptions of racism were stronger. So in other words, the more people identified with being white, the less racism they saw, but this was especially so in the treatment condition, which on one hand, we had some optimism, right? So if you give people or have people engage with these critical histories, they might be more willing to see how racism might be functioning in our society today. But we also have to think about for whom that might work. And so in this next brief intervention study, we turned away from general racism in society, but thinking about how current conversations around voter suppression and whether that's racism relevant might also show similar effects. So for example, many states instituted new laws that were more restrictive in who could vote and the sort of policies around voting. So for example, many states instituted more strict voter ID laws, what could be shown as legitimate identification. So for example, some states, I believe it was Alabama, where if you're in public housing, that's a federally government issued ID, but that wasn't able to be used, but perhaps your gun license might be. So there was some conversations about, okay, what's the racism relevance in how these policies are being pushed forward? So we thought there might be similar Black-white differences in seeing these type of policies as racism relevant or not. So we collected our study online. Here we had about even Black and white Americans. In this case, we're going to expose them to a set of historical facts related to racism in our voting history. Then we're going to ask them their perceptions of racism in some current day voting policies, ask them about their perceptions of voter suppression, again, ask them about their racial identity, and across all the studies, we have always included demographic questions. Okay, so perceptions of racism and voting policies. A participant might see an item like strict voter ID laws require residents to show identification with the current street address. However, some Native American reservations do not use physical street addresses, and others use post office boxes as their permanent addresses. To what extent do you think racism is a major factor? So racism not a factor, or racism is a major factor. We also asked them whether they thought voter suppression was a racism relevant problem in the United States. So for example, they might rate on a scale from 1 to 7, voter suppression is a problem in the US, and reverse coded is the idea that claims of voter suppression based on race are wildly exaggerated, right? We're focusing too much on that. That's not a real issue. For our historical knowledge exposure, in this case, we gave participants 8 facts, either in our control condition, so they were still political in that they were presidential related. So for example, Lyndon B. Johnson assumed the presidency after assassination of JFK and won the upcoming election in 1964 by 61% of the popular vote. And so we tried to make sure that our presidential facts were matched in time and context with our critical voting knowledge. So for example, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlawed discrimination based on race, but did not bar other qualifications or barriers to voting, like literacy tests, poll taxes, which also targeted Black communities. So they would see a fact, they would then have a test question. We wanted to make sure that they were engaging with these facts, not just clicking through. So they would answer the question. If they answered it correctly, they'd be reinforced by a prompt that said, yes, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 did outlaw discrimination, but did not bar other qualifications like poll tax and literacy tests. If they got the answer incorrect, they would see, no, actually, the Civil Rights Act outlaw discrimination, right? So just, again, this is about reinforcing the information for our participants. So first, I want to suggest that we saw similar gaps in perception among our Black and white participants. Our Black Americans were more likely to see racism embedded in those voting policies, and they were more likely to see voter suppression as a racism relevant problem. And so you might be wondering what happened with the exposure of these facts for each condition. So first, among our Black participants, whether they saw the control facts or the critical education facts, it didn't really have much impact on their perceptions of racism. And no matter how much they identified with being Black, that also didn't play a role, right? So our Black participants are generally seeing our voter suppression as racism relevant. Now, if we look at our white American participants, this green line here is the control condition. And you can see that overall, right, they're seeing less racism than our Black Americans if we do the side-by-side comparison. But that's in the control condition, right? We see the gap that we had seen in previous studies and on the previous slide. But what happens among the participants who actually engaged with our critical history facts? Well, it depended on whether they were highly identified with being white or lowly identified with being white. So as you can see, within the critical education condition, the more our participants identified with being white, so those highly identified white participants saw voter suppression as not as much as a racism relevant problem. And that's in comparison to the control. So the perceptions of racism actually go down in light of exposure to these historical facts. For those on the lower end of white racial identity, the exposure to the facts actually increased their perceptions of voter suppression as a racism relevant problem in comparison to the control. And if you look side by side, they actually look much more similar to our Black American participants than the other participants in this condition. Okay, so I threw a lot of data at you, but to sort of bring it home, what we're seeing is that knowledge of historical racism can be a tool or a lens through which we might understand racism today. And that exposure might increase awareness of how racism is operating and might increase awareness of privilege. And these things might facilitate our fight for fighting injustice. But in the same vein, for the effects that sort of boosting perceptions of racism, we also saw signs of negative responses or backlash, particularly among our participants who are highly identified with being white, right? So within those conditions, the same kind of intervention might have a boosting effect for one set of participants, but a dampening effect for another. And I think we're starting to see some of this backlash play out in real time in our society today, right? So we're seeing sort of some pushback on topics like I'm speaking on today, like critical race theory, but also some uncertainty about what it is, right? That we're pushing back against critical race theory without necessarily understanding exactly what it is. The same thing is happening with sort of pushing of an anti-woke agenda, not being able to define exactly what we're talking about. And I want to suggest to you that where these pushbacks are happening is not inconsequential, right? So the same places where we're seeing an increase in restrictions on voting or more strict stance on who can vote and how they might be able to exercise their rights, there's some overlap in these states that are pushing against or banning, restricting the teaching of not just critical race theory, but teaching Black history and other things related to anti-racism. And so I want to return to this idea about thinking about how cultural psychology and critical race theory might inform our understanding of racism. So earlier I suggested that cultural psychologists like to think about culture like the water and sort of raw fish kind of swimming around. But if we think about race and racism as this sort of cultural context, you might think of this as we're swimming in toxic water. And so what does that suggest to us about solutions? We can take the fish out of the water. We might be able to clean him off, change his heart and mind. But then once we put him back into that, in the fish bowl or back into the water, toxic water is still influencing how his experiences and what's going on. And so I want to suggest that part of our role is not just to address individuals, but also to think about how we might build anti-racist worlds that might shape our perceptions of who we are and how we're going to relate to one another. And with that, I have some special thanks and acknowledgements. So that second brief intervention was actually a study done by for an undergraduate thesis, Maria Rojas. And I'd like to just thank all the undergraduate research assistants who have been involved in this work and my collaborators. So anything you didn't like, it's on me. Everything you loved, it was really a function of me working with them. So I think I saved time for questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salter. You're doing such important work, and it was really wonderful. I enjoyed reading your papers, but I really enjoyed hearing you present your work. So everybody, we now have time for questions. Here's how we're going to do it. Please put your name in the chat if you'd like to ask a question, so that it would be easier for us to establish the queue. And I'm just going to, by the power vested in me by being a co-host of this meeting, I'm going to get us started, giving you all a little bit of time to put your names in the chat. You must have answered this question many, many times when you present your work, but I'm still going to ask. So, and it kind of, the question starts where you left off your presentation, that the recent climate of the CRT bans and the book bans, it almost seems like this is the backlash that you were finding in your studies. So first of all, do you see that connection? Do you think this is that kind of backlash? And I'm wondering how it has affected your work, and how has it, what effect, if any, has it on the students engaging with your work? You just mentioned your undergraduates. So just could you speak to that context, impact of that context on your work?
Yes. So, I mean, of course, it's in the back of my mind, right? So North Carolina is another state that has been discussing whether critical race theory should be able to be taught or integrated into the classroom. I do have some privilege that right now I'm at a private institution who's very supportive of this kind of work and sees the benefits of having these conversations and engaging with not only the historical past, but current day manifestations of racism and the potential links between them. I think, I do think about this in terms of teaching in the classroom, right? So I teach classes that are centered on these topics and introduce these topics. And so, I see my job and my role is to speak to everyone, right? To teach everyone. And so I think what gives me some hope is that at least in the classroom, there's a process of establishing trust and understanding and mutual sort of respect for one another. And so we may or may not come to the exact same perspective on things, but I think in those dynamics, there's a way to engage conversations and that can be expanded and engaged truly because of a trust. Within a brief intervention like this, the participants don't know who I am. They don't know why I might be asking the questions that I'm asking. And, I'm thankful that they answer them honestly. But I do think that we're capturing some reactants and some backlash effects because some of this information may not make us feel the most comfortable or may, make us not feel so great. And so how do we reconcile that is, part of what I'm still looking at and pursuing.
Thank you. I have other questions, but I'll hold them for now so that we can go to our queue. Marta, I see a question. Can you please unmute yourself? I think everybody should now have the ability to unmute yourself to ask a question.
Yes, I can. Well, thank you for this wonderful talk. My question is about if you could describe a little bit in more detail, who are the people who highly identify as white and who are the people who are white, but they don't identify as much as white, right? I'm thinking, for example, where white Latinos fall into that scale. If you could describe this in more detail. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you for your question. So it's sort of two-pronged. So first, I'll say in this, in recruiting participants, we recruit both Black, white, non-Hispanic. So there's a whole set of questions and a whole research agenda that could be sort of pursued on that question alone. And I do have a colleague who has started to look at other racial minority groups and their perceptions of racism. And so far, they seem to fall in between Black and white. But there's also the complication that you can be Black and be Latino, and you could be white and be Latino. So that's a complexity that's not embedded in the participants in these particular studies. But yeah, I think it's a great question that colleagues and collaborators are pursuing at this time. And then I think another piece of your question was about, maybe I will put it in my own words, like, so what does it mean to be highly identified as white? What does it mean to be lowly identified as white? And, we spent a lot of time, I would say psychologists have spent a lot of time talking about how we all need to recognize that we have a racial identity, right? So pushing back against sort of a colorblind, right? I don't have a race, I don't see race. And so, on one hand, identifying with the racial group is actually a positive thing. We all have experiences that are shaped by our different backgrounds. And so I want to just point out in this case, it is folks who derive good feelings from being white who are the highly identified white in this case. So we also included questions about, I guess it would be racial centrality, like I can't think of the example right now, but I would think of it as not necessarily about how being white makes me feel, but just, yes, I belong to this group. This is a identity that is in my background. That kind of measurement of identity didn't have these same effects. It was really the form of identity that was around the affect and feeling good to belong to one's racial group that was characterizing these participants.
Thank you. I do see the next question in the queue, but again, by the power vested in me, just a tiny clarification question on this point, because one of my questions was related to that. Would it be fair to then characterize this maybe as racial pride?
I do think racial pride is a component.
It's just people who are proud of being, not just
I feel good.
Okay. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Sean, go ahead, please.
Oh, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, excellent. So this was amazing. I just thought it was fantastic. I love the research. I love everything that you're doing. So please keep on doing it, right? Because I think that we need this type of research to oppose the anti-woke folks, right? Because it's very clear that those who are sitting with their eyes wide shut are only being detrimental to themselves and everybody else. But my question is looking more at some of those nuances that are sometimes difficult to capture, right? And I'm just thinking of, for example, is it at all even possible to kind of break out, people's kind of economic class in terms of the folks that you're looking at, or even, because it can go one of two ways, or also identifying whether or not they're going to like all white schools, or if they, because I'm thinking that in some cases, some people, are living in environments where they are, I guess you could say, integrating into the white community, or they may be the only Black person in a white identified area. And we all know that to a certain degree, that idea of double consciousness, that they're still living in the society, but and even if they themselves may experience some of the racism, which actually I find that those who are living in those types of environments tend to understand even more because they've had a lot of microaggressions addressed to them. But how do you kind of suss out some of those little nuances that I think make a difference, particularly in the Black community, in terms of how we see ourselves, right? So I could see when you said that question, I didn't immediately, one of the things I immediately thought of is, some people, they might be classified as Black in American society, but they might classify themselves as mixed, right?
Mhm.
Or they might classify themselves as human. Love it when people do that. So nothing wrong with it, by the way. I don't want to offend anybody if they classify themselves as human, right? But those types of things, did you notice any types of differences if you were able to find those types of nuances?
Right. Great questions. Lots of questions. And I'm making notes like, oh, I could look at that in the data.
You just have to do one. Don't try.
Yeah. So I will say a connection between some of the work that I've done looking at honestly how Black history is represented in schools. And you mentioned like, yeah, you might have gone to all white school or all Black school, and so I don't have an answer to how the school composition shapes individual responses. But I would like to suggest that like part of this question is, okay, so if, painting a big swath over a bunch of people, right? Black Americans might have more of this knowledge versus white American where are they getting this knowledge from? And so in predominantly white schools, if they're not talking about these historical barriers or some of these instances of racism in the past, then white Americans might not have been exposed to some of that information and might see less. But from my experience, I'll say personally, Black Americans who might be in those same spaces might still get exposure to that content, either in socialization or through the home or through Black media content. And so, I do think that those factors definitely matter. And I don't have data to predict individual responses, but I do think the context that we're in is going to shape what we know or what we're going to be seeking out for further knowledge, and that those things are having an impact on what we see.
Thank you. That was amazing.
Thank you. You're so kind. Thank you so much.
Thank you. On to the next question in the chat. Karen, please go ahead.
Thank you so much for the great talk. And these are things maybe you've alluded to already, but do you observe any social desirability bias among the participants that you include in the study? And also, how does intersectionality tend to play out among the participants? So for example, being white and female or being Black and female, how do you see how that plays out in the data that you have?
Yeah, so I will say, in terms of intersectionality, we try to, for example, make sure that our facts aren't just all Black men, for example, right? We try to have a gender balance, and probably not as good on thinking about other identities that obviously are informing critical history. But I have been thinking about, for example, thinking about queer studies and Black studies and some historical facts and how that might have some interesting interplays and dynamics. I think the other question, social desirability. Most times I give people opportunity to tell me whatever they want at the end of the study, sort of open-ended. And I would say that maybe there's some social desirability, but people say what's on their minds in those opportunities. So for example, there was a response that was like, you and the work you're doing, this kind of survey is the root of all racism. I'm going to suggest that person was being pretty honest and not subject to social desirability in that case. But, that doesn't mean that people aren't telling me what they think I want to hear. And I think that could play a role in some of the measures, but I think overarching and overall, I think social desirability, for example, in the history test, if you think that I'm looking for people to say that racism is a big factor, then they might actually say true to saying racism everywhere. And that's, we're able to distinguish the fact from the fiction. And so it's a complicated question. But that's the answer I would offer.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. Marsha, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you. Thank you so much for this amazing presentation and for your contributions on this research. It's really impressive, and I'm so glad that I got to hear it from you today. My question relates to the interaction effect that you repeatedly found regarding the condition, the sort of treatment condition with the knowledge, the critical race knowledge, interacting with the subject's self-regard as, more strongly identified as white, being proud of being white, and finding that troubling. I'm looking to hear your thoughts on what you might draw from your research or from other related research on how what manipulations or what interventions could be productive for those folks. I'm encouraged that at least I appreciate that depending on the participants, that information can be productive. And I sort of was wondering, do the folks who identify more strongly as white, are they sort of not saying they're learning as much as well? Or they're just not taking it in? Or are there other mechanisms that might help us understand how to address that issue?
Yeah, great question and ongoing. So I think, right, so this is speculation, right? I think what's happening is perhaps in these conditions, there's an experience of threat, right? A threat to one's identity. And so I've been thinking about one, demonstrating that that's what's going on. Do people, for example, are those participants, would they increase their identification with the group just in light of having this information, right? Is it functioning as some kind of threat? And I don't know if anyone has looked at this in terms of knowledge, but I do know there has been some past work where people would offer a self-affirmation. And so having people affirm other parts of the self produced more perceptions of racism among white participants. So that might be kind of a fruitful, maybe a fruitful path. And then I think there's part of me that both wants to envelop those who are open to change and open to the intervention and open to knowledge and open to learning, and then provide those tools, provide that information, provide those conversations, and really foster that. Because where I see the work really needing to happen is in the context, in these policies and laws, in the schools, so that, again, so people who are open can be exposed or at least engage with these conversations in a way so that they could have a better understanding of how these things might be impacting Black communities and other communities as well. But I would say, there's certainly, I think, room and space to try to better understand those who may be showing a backlash effect or perhaps experiencing some identity threat in these conditions. I don't have those solutions in my data or in my tool set yet.
Thank you for sharing those thoughts and reflections.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today and engaging productively, asking questions. Thank you so much to Dr. Salter for taking the time to present her research. I'm so thrilled that we were able to have this opportunity to hear directly from you about your research. It's been really wonderful. I thank you. And I think I join lots of other people in thanking you.
Oh, thank you. And also thank you all for your great questions. I've written them down so I can continue to mull and chew on them. So it only helps me push the work forward. So I really appreciate it.